Say that again. Paul's voice cut through the amplifiers before the bass even stopped ringing. Jacksonville, September 1964. The Gator Bowl was packed past capacity. Over 20,000 voices screaming into the humid Florida night. And none of them had heard it the way the four men on that stage just had. For a moment, no one moved. The words had come from somewhere in the lower deck, close enough to carry, ugly enough that George's fingers slid off the fretboard mid-chord. Ringo's sticks hovered an inch above the snare, frozen. John turned his head slowly toward Paul, the way he did when something needed to be handled, and everyone silently agreed who would handle it. Paul stood there with his hands still resting on the strings, not playing, not speaking, just staring out into a crowd of 20,000 faces he could no longer see individually, only feel, pressing in from the dark. Somewhere in that stadium was a 19-year-old girl in the front section who had been told twice by security not to be there. She hadn't moved either. She was watching Paul's face the way you watch someone deciding something that will matter long after the concert ends. Nobody in that crowd knew what Paul McCartney was about to do next. Nobody knew that in less than 60 seconds, this would stop being a concert and become something Jacksonville would talk about for the rest of the century. And nobody, not the band, not the promoters standing rigid in the wings, not even Paul himself in that first frozen second, knew exactly how far he was willing to take it. The band had a contract, a single clause buried in the fine print that some people in that stadium had already decided to test. George, his jaw was tight enough to ache. He didn't look at the crowd. He looked at Paul, waiting for a signal, the way bandmates do when 4 years of stages together teaches you to read a back before a face. Ringo lowered his stick slow, careful not to make it look like surrender. And John just watched, arms loose at his sides, letting the silence stretch a half-second longer than comfortable, because he already sensed that whatever came next needed to come from Paul alone. 3 hours earlier, none of them had known this night would test anything at all. The Gator Bowl show had been booked like any other stop on the tour. Screaming fans, motorcade routes kept secret from the press, a promoter fussing over microphone levels backstage. But buried in the contract for that Jacksonville date was a single line the band's management had insisted on: no segregated seating. It wasn't a grand political statement when they'd signed it. It was simply something Paul, John, George, and Ringo had agreed on quietly, almost without discussion, months before, that they wouldn't play to a crowd divided by color. Not in Florida, not anywhere. Paul hadn't thought much about that clause since signing it. But standing there now, bass silent in his hands, something older stirred in him. A memory of his mother, Mary, a district nurse in Liverpool, who used to bring him along on house calls to the poorest streets in the city, the ones other people crossed the road to avoid. She died when he was 14, but her voice hadn't. You don't get to decide someone's worth by looking at them, Paul. She'd said it so often, it stopped sounding like advice and started sounding like fact. He hadn't expected to hear her voice tonight of all nights, in a stadium 3,000 miles from Liverpool. Backstage before the show, a local promoter had pulled their tour manager aside, voice low, almost friendly. Just a word of advice, the man had said, smiling in a way that didn't reach his eyes. Some folks around here don't take kindly to being told how to run their own stadium. Nobody had thought much of it at the time. The warning turned out to mean more than anyone backstage had wanted to admit. An hour before the Beatles took the stage, the opening act, a local rhythm and blues outfit, had already caught the edge of it. A cluster of men near the lower rail had been loud from the start, shouting over the music, tossing the occasional bottle cap toward the stage lights. Security moved them twice, and twice they drifted back. One man in particular stood out, mid-30s, sunburned, a voice that carried further than it should have, needling the opening singers with comments just quiet enough to avoid a real confrontation, just loud enough for the people around him to hear and laugh along. Paul had clocked him from the wings before the Beatles even walked out. He hadn't said anything to the others. There didn't seem to be a reason to. Not yet. Inside, though, something had already shifted. Paul had spent 4 years learning how to read a crowd the way a sailor reads weather, the small signs before the storm. Tonight the signs were there, and they made him uneasy in a way Hamburg clubs and cavern basements never had. This wasn't drunken rowdiness. This was something with teeth, something that had shown up already decided about who belonged in that stadium and who didn't. He carried that unease onto the stage with him, buried under the noise and the lights and the opening chords, telling himself it was nothing, that 20,000 fans screaming his name would drown out one ugly voice in a crowd this size. For the first few songs, it seemed true. The band was tight, the crowd was theirs, and whatever tension had gathered backstage dissolved into the ordinary chaos of a Beatles show. Girls fainting near the barricades, flashbulbs popping in the dark, security dragging fans back over the rail every few minutes. Then came the quieter song, the one where the crowd noise always dipped, just enough to hear the harmonies clearly. And in that dip, in that half-second where 20,000 voices softened to let the music breathe, the same sunburned man from the opening act found his moment. Paul heard him start to speak before the words fully landed. A beat of sound rising out of the lower deck, aimed not at the band, but at the people standing near that 19-year-old girl in the front section, the ones who'd been told twice already that they didn't belong there. The band reached the bridge of the song, and then everything went quiet a half-second too long. The words landed in full this time. No fragments, no half-heard noise lost in the crowd. Ugly, deliberate, aimed straight at the group of people standing near the front rail who'd been told all night they had no right to stand there. The sunburned man didn't shout it once and stop. He said it like he wanted it heard, like he'd been waiting all evening for a quiet enough moment to make sure it landed clean. Paul's hand went still on the strings. He didn't react instantly. That was the strange part. The part George would talk about years later. How long Paul let the silence sit before he moved. He looked out at the crowd, not searching for the man's face specifically, but taking in the whole stadium at once. The thousands of faces waiting to see what would happen. He looked back at John, who gave the smallest nod, the kind that meant go. He looked toward the wings, where the promoter stood rigid, already predicting the cost of whatever came next. And then his eyes found her, the girl in the front section, the one who'd stood her ground twice already. She wasn't looking away. She wasn't crying. She was just watching him, waiting to see if the clause in that contract had meant anything at all, or if it had just been ink. That was the moment that decided him. Paul stepped to the microphone. He didn't raise his voice. If anything, he spoke quieter than usual, which made 20,000 people lean in to hear him. "My mother used to bring me to the poorest streets in Liverpool," he said. "Houses some folks wouldn't walk past, let alone walk into. She was a nurse. She went in anyway. And she used to tell me something I never forgot. You don't get to decide someone's worth by looking at them." He paused, let it breathe. "I've carried that with me my whole life, and I'm not about to put it down tonight, in this stadium, for anyone." He turned slightly toward the section where the girl stood. These people paid the same money everyone else in this stadium paid. They stood in the same lines, waited in the same heat, and somebody back there just decided that wasn't good enough for them. His eyes moved toward the lower deck, toward the sunburned man, though he never pointed, never named him. "So here's what's going to happen. Either you sit down, shut your mouth, and listen to the music like everyone else paid to do, or you can walk out right now, and we'll gladly keep playing without you." The stadium held its breath. For a moment that felt far longer than it was, nobody moved. Then from somewhere near the lower rail, a ripple of motion, the sunburned man shoving past the people beside him, storming toward the exit tunnel, muttering loud enough for the nearby seats to hear. A few others rose with him, following in a small, resentful cluster. But it wasn't that movement that made the whole stadium go silent again. It was the sight of someone else, a single figure detaching from the crowd near the front rail, walking steadily toward the stage, past the security barricade, straight into the light. And nobody watching, not even Paul, knew yet whether they were about to witness something dangerous or something none of them would ever forget. Security tensed near the barricade, one guard already stepping forward to intercept whoever was closing the distance toward the stage. But Paul lifted a hand, not sharply, just enough to signal wait, because he'd already recognized who it was. It was her, the girl from the front section, the one who'd stood her ground through 2 warnings and a stadium full of tension aimed her way. She wasn't running, she wasn't causing a scene. She walked the way someone walks when they've finally been given permission to be seen, straight up to the edge of the stage, and stopped there, looking up at him. For a moment, Paul didn't know what to say. 20,000 people were watching, and for once in his life, he let the silence do the talking. Then he crouched down at the edge of the stage, closer to her level, and said something only she could hear. Whatever it was, her eyes filled, and she nodded, and stepped back into the crowd, not to hide this time, but to stand exactly where she'd been standing all along, only now surrounded by people who were applauding her, not staring at her. The stadium didn't erupt all at once. It built in waves, first the section near the front rail, then spreading outward, thousands of hands coming together, some people rising to their feet, others staying seated with their arms crossed, faces unreadable in the dark. Not everyone in that stadium agreed with what had just happened. A scattering of people filtered toward the exits in the minutes that followed, quiet, deliberate, making their disapproval known without another word. But the noise that filled the Gator Bowl in that moment belonged to the ones who stayed. Backstage, once the band finally walked off after the final song, the mood was different than any show before it. John said almost nothing, which unsettled the others more than if he'd made a joke about it, the way he usually did after a wild night. George sat quietly in the corner of the dressing room, arms crossed, something like pride settled into his face that he didn't try to explain. Ringo just kept saying, quietly, to no one in particular, that he was glad nobody got hurt. Paul sat by himself for a moment, bass case still unopened at his feet, replaying the girl's face at the edge of the stage, his mother's voice still somewhere underneath his own. Then their tour manager pushed through the dressing room door, out of breath, a folded copy of the local evening edition already gripped in his hand. A reporter was outside, he said, already asking questions, already asking exactly what Paul had said to that girl at the edge of the stage, and how much trouble it was about to cause. The trouble came quickly, and it came from directions the band hadn't fully braced for. Within 2 days, 3 radio stations across the Florida Panhandle quietly pulled Beatles songs from rotation, citing nothing officially, though everyone understood why. A promoter 2 cities down the tour route called ahead, nervous, asking whether the band planned on making another speech at his venue. Letters arrived at the label's regional office by the following week, a mix of support and venom in roughly equal measure, some of them ugly enough that management chose not to show the band all of it. Colonel-style pressure came too, though quieter than shouted threats. A few sponsors murmuring concerns about the tour's direction, a couple of local officials making it known they wouldn't be rolling out any welcome mats next time the band came through. None of it stopped the single show, but all of it lingered, a low hum of consequence trailing the tour through the rest of that September. The girl from the front section, meanwhile, found her own life quietly altered by that night. A local newspaper ran a small piece the following week, not naming her directly, respecting the request she'd made through a family friend, but describing a young woman at the center of a moment audiences in Jacksonville won't soon forget. Neighbors who'd never spoken to her began stopping by. A few letters arrived at her family's home, most of them kind, a handful not. She kept the folded newspaper clipping for the rest of her life, tucked into a drawer, taken out only on nights she needed reminding that being seen once, really seen, by 20,000 strangers and one exhausted band had actually meant something. Paul carried Jacksonville with him for the rest of that tour, though he rarely spoke of it directly. It surfaced instead in small ways, a pause before certain songs, a look toward the front rows he hadn't had before that night, one he'd never entirely lose. Decades later, when people asked Paul about Jacksonville, he rarely told the whole story the way it happened. He'd mention the heat, the contract clause, maybe the song they were playing when it happened. He almost never mentioned his mother by name, though those close to him understood that her voice had been the one steering him that night, the way it had steered so many of his quieter decisions long after she was gone. Some things, he seemed to feel, belonged only to him. The girl he'd spoken to at the edge of the stage was never publicly identified. She kept it that way by choice, content to let the moment exist as something private, hers alone, rather than a story retold for strangers. But those who knew her said she never forgot the sound of a stadium turning, wave by wave, in her direction. What happened in Jacksonville didn't end segregation. It didn't change every mind in that stadium, and it certainly didn't erase whatever hatred had walked out through the exit tunnels that night. But it drew a line, publicly, in a place and time where drawing it cost something real. 4 young men from Liverpool, still barely out of their 20s, chose a 19-year-old stranger's dignity over an easy night and an uncomplicated ovation. Somewhere in Florida, a folded newspaper clipping sat in a drawer for the rest of a lifetime. And somewhere else, a bass player kept walking onto stages for the next 50 years, never quite forgetting the half-second of silence before he decided who he was going to be.